Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Eve Morrison. She is a historian specialising in the revolutionary period, 1916 to 1923, and its social and cultural memory. Both her doctoral research on the Bureau of Military History and postdoctoral fellowship on the Ernie O'Malley notebook interviews were funded by the Irish Research Council, and from 2018 to 2021 she was the Canon Murray Fellow in Irish History at St Catherine's College, University of Oxford. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting a paper on the ongoing search for peace, would you please welcome Dr. Eve Morrison.
Hello. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak, and also to say how much I've enjoyed the papers. It's been really fascinating. I've learned a lot. I also have learned a lot over lunch, learning about other people's research. Now, the subject of my paper is peace moves and the attempts to end the Civil War. Now, negotiations between both sides of the split over the terms of the treaty were initiated during the truce. Periodic efforts were made by neutral bodies and combatants throughout the Civil War to bring it to the end. And so you're discussing this topic, I'm going to be addressing a lot of the themes, or several themes that some of the earlier speakers have brought up, as we'll see. Now, I became interested in this topic when I was researching a book of mine that was published, my only book, I should say, that was published a few months ago about a War of Independence ambush called Kilmichael. And I came across this public row between Frank Aiken, who was then the Fianna Fáil Minister for Defence, and Tom Berry, the famous West Cork IRA commander. And this occurred in 1934. Now, Berry was actually in jail at this stage because he had rejoined the IRA a couple of years earlier. And the row came about because Aiken had been heckled. He was at a public event by people in the audience going, "Up Tom Berry! Where's Tom Berry? Up to 77." And he lost his temper. And he said, "Oh, you young people don't know what you're at if you're praising Tom Berry," because when, other anti-treaty IRA men had been fighting or being executed, Berry had been running around the country trying to make peace. And a huge, a public row breaks out. And Tom Berry flatly denies ever having tried to engage in any peace moves. He denied ever having spoken to a Free State officer or urging anti-treaty forces to destroy their arms, which are all things that in the bandy back and forth between he and Aiken, Aiken had brought up. And so one of the things, the thing that was interesting about it to me is because there's actually loads of evidence that Berry had done all of those things, right? And that this is being confirmed, by Moss Toomey, who's the chief of staff of the IRA from 1926 to 36. And Moss Toomey, who knew he would have had the same papers that Aiken had at one time had access to, and he said Aiken did have papers relating to all this, but that he didn't release them because it would have implicated people who are now in Fianna Fáil. And I think it just goes to show you how even then the peace moves and the efforts for peace during the Civil War was still really controversial. I mean, I actually think sometimes the stuff about the silence about the Civil War and things is a little bit exaggerated. There was obvious reasons why the state couldn't commemorate the Civil War, but actually anti-treatyites talked about it a lot. They were very happy to talk to Ernie O'Malley, and a lot of the children of the veterans I've spoken to say, "Oh, I wish I'd paid more attention." It's like, young people aren't really that interested in what their parents their parents' lives until they get a few gray hairs themselves, and so a lot of times they regret that they didn't, listen more. Now, in terms of Berry, he was a very mercurial individual, and he often kind of flip-flopped and gave, different versions of events. So in that sense, I suppose the confrontation with Aiken reflected his personality. But, as I said, I think it's about more than that. And the thing is, Ernie O'Malley, for instance, who did a very useful set of interviews in the 40s and 50s with anti-treatyites, he was a hardliner, all right, as some of the other earlier speakers have said, but he was very interested in in peace moves, and he talked. There's a lot about it in his interviews from various quarters. So they're a very useful source, and I did a lot of research into them as well. So that also sparked my interest. And I think, actually, maybe do we get a slide here? Yeah, and so those are, if you're interested, like those are some of the individuals he interviews that discuss the various peace moves at the time. And I think that, geez, I think I'm missing a page here. Oh well, but and so I think. Also, some of the disputes between the IRA, part of the reason why I think it's important is it reflects the fact that some of those, and particularly those who got involved in the neutral IRA, and I'll come back to this, however much they didn't like the treaty, they were not comfortable taking action that it was very clear by the summer of 1922 that the majority of the Irish population opposed. All right, and so the thing is, and so these are the people, like the Republican movement had been fighting for the previous few years on their behalf, and here they were doing something that was clearly opposed to what most of them wanted. As you know, in April 22, there was a general strike that was against militarism on both sides. Crucially, not just the anti-treaty sides. It just came the week after the occupation of the forecourts, and this was apparently bigger than the conscription crisis, the strike against conscription in 1918, and then again in the general election, as Professor Hoyt was talking about in June 22, it reaffirmed the gulf between the priorities of the IRA leadership and those of the population. And so despite Eamon de Valera and Michael Collins' election pact and a considerable amount of intimidation by the local IRA in some areas, the Labour Party, the Farmers' Party and Independents, who were all effectively in favour of the settlement, stood candidates. And this was described by Emmett O'Connor as the only alternative to continued Sinn Féin dictatorship. But collectively, they garnered about 40% of the vote, and almost the same percentage of the remainder supported pro-treaty Sinn Féin. So however much, the Irish population were unenamored with the treaty, they preferred a settlement with Britain to a return to war. And because this is clear throughout the conflict. And what's interesting, what you see during the Civil War is neither side, combatants on neither side are really interested in taking this on board. The provisional governments say that they said that the election confirmed that that they were in the right, but they also then prorogued the Dáil for about 5 times over the summer of 22 because they knew that the TDs who were in there wouldn't support the war effort. And then the anti-treatyites decided to fight despite the fact that they knew that they didn't have popular support. And this is, and this was never in any doubt because throughout the conflict, although they never, the combatants didn't pay much heed, county and urban districts and rural councils from around the country's workers' organisations, trade unions, the Irish Labour Party, the Women's International League, the Cork's People's Rights Association, the Irish Farmers Union, the People's Peace Leagues, George Russell, the writer, they all either, put forward some sort of peace moves or they supported some of the actions of the anti-treaty, the neutral IRA, which I'm going to talk about now. Now, this is Bill Kissan has written some very interesting stuff about civil society, and that's a select list of some of the organizations that supported an organization called the Neutral IRA. It was a veterans organization, and it was set up so it was established in December 22 by the Cork IRA, by Sean O'Hegarty, or 2 members of the Cork 1 IRA, Sean O'Hegarty and Florrie O'Donoghue. It was composed entirely of pre-truce IRA men, and it made continuous efforts to broker a peace without success until it was eventually dissolved in March 23. And really, it's funny that Cork was one of the kind of the storm centre, if you like, of the Irish War of Independence. It was also the kind of storm centre of efforts towards peace as well. It was kind of ironic. O'Donoghue and O'Hegarty are interesting because they both opposed the treaty, but in April and May 22, they, along with Sean Hales, actually resigned from the anti-treaty IRA executive in the Four Courts in protest at the suggestion by a wing of the anti-treaty leadership that a general election be forcibly prevented, that there was a kind of a wing who wanted to establish a military dictatorship, and they resigned rather than do that, despite the... And they reckon, as I think, as Professor Hoyt said, the neutral IRA had something in the region of 20,000 members, and they might have had more. And they, you know, and then I found some of their literature and things, and it's very interesting the way they couch their arguments for peace. Found one in February 23, and they're calling on all parties to recognize the elected majority to form a government representing the will of the people, which shall be the supreme constitutional authority in Ireland. In other words, they're saying the majority of the population don't support us, and this is a problem. All right, and so this is very interesting. There's I think, there's a link between their efforts to start the war and this kind of, reasoning in terms of democracy. Now, as we know, and as other speakers have outlined, Liam Lynch, who was the chief of staff of the anti-treaty IRA, refused to back down. He insisted that the anti-treatyites could win, and this is despite having very little public support. Lynch and the other hardliners, they ignored the peace moves from civil society. They also refused to meet with the neutral IRA and they were very worried and did everything they could to prevent unauthorized peace negotiations. In September 1922, Lynch complained to Ernie O'Malley, who's then a second in command, about the number of private and unauthorized individuals who were approaching individual IRA officers who were endeavoring to bring about peace. Now, and this was happening on both sides, and hardliners on both sides objected to it. Richard Mulcahy, who was upbraided by his colleagues when he engaged in a kind of secret talks with Eamon de Valera, and this was in September 22. So people didn't, people who wanted to prosecute the war did not want this to happen. But you have other National Army officers: Emma Dalton, Charles Russell, Liam Tobin, Sean Hales, Tom Ennis were also involved in peace feelers. Actually, Sean Hales wasn't in the army, but the other ones were. And also Tom Maguire, who was a staunch irredentist Republican from Mayo. He talks about Michael Collins hoping in the early days of the Civil War that the three Toms, Tom Barry, Tom Hales, and Tom Maguire, would join forces to try and end the conflict as well. So the dangers of these sorts of peace moves and these unofficial efforts is a reoccurring theme in anti-treaty correspondence. But despite several stern warnings and formal orders against these unofficial moves, it proved impossible to enforce. And so clandestine meetings were held that were often brokered by priests. Like Father Thomas Duggan, by Canon Eamon O'Kennedy, Archbishop Harty of Cashel. They all made attempts to broker deals. And the thing is, and the reason why the anti-treaty were worried about it is because it did kind of undermine their bargaining position a bit. And these peace moves were so vigorously pursued in Cork by Duggan, Sean O'Hegarty, and Florrie O'Donoghue that Liam Lynch forbade anybody to have any sort of communications with any of the three of them at all in March 23. Now, by that stage, the government had executed, I think, over 50 prisoners. They passed public emergency powers legislation in September. The executions began after the assassination of the anti-treatyites assassinated pro-treaty TD Sean Hales. And by January, it was pretty clear that the anti-treatyites were fighting a war that they couldn't win. And one of the main reasons for this was that they had very little public support. I mean, there was the other reason people were talking about the National Army and their strategies. That's important, but so is public support, particularly for a guerrilla army. And this comes up a lot in the Ernie O'Malley notebook. So this is one typical from Mossy Donegan. He just says, the people were fed up with the whole thing. The bridges were down, roads were impossible, the railways were gone, and they couldn't see an end to this thing. As well, there was the danger of getting shot. Our friendly people were eaten out of house and home. The horses and cattle had been taken away. You know, and so there's lots of comments about this and descriptions like this. And so in the situation, in this period, in like early 23, you have a situation where the anti-treatyites are losing, and they're now the prisoners, the anti-treaty prisoners who are in prison are under threat of execution. All right? And then there's kind of a bombshell in January 23, which is after the arrest of Liam Deasy, who was Deputy Chief of Staff to the anti-treaty IRA. Now, he'd already been negotiating with Hegarty and O'Donoghue to try and find some way to bring the conflict to the end. But after he was captured, basically, he was tried and he was sentenced to death. And so, but he chose between. They basically gave him an option. You say you're in favor of an unconditional surrender, or you're going to be executed. So he chose the former as he put it, the only realistic means of securing the republic in the longer term. And it had, it rippled out. It really was a bombshell, because here you had a very respected leader of the anti-treaty executive who was saying we can't win this war, and suddenly so the prisoners are going, and we're in here under what are we dying for? We're under threat of execution for what? And so you have this sort of movement then who along with Liam Deasy, you have lots of prisoners, particularly all over the South, who, if you like, they decide that they, like Liam Deasy, that they have more to contribute by living for Ireland than dying for it, if you like. And Deasy was very clear about this. He said, "I'm prepared to bear any and all the shame that will follow." And so he issues the unconditional surrender. And Bill Quirk, who's the OC of the IRA Second Southern Division, I think he says it to O'Malley. I didn't write down the source of it, but he said, from then on, things began to go to hell, right? And so, some people hated Deasy for surrendering, but it was very unsettling. And also, it garnered considerable sympathy. There's like, in some of the correspondence, there's two sets of letters from Frank Barrett and things like this. There's one saying, we absolutely can't support this. And then they have another letter saying we reject your terms, but we have profound respect for your moral courage. And then you also start having kind of letters and actions in prisoners, among prisoners under threat of execution in Tyrone, in Limerick, in Clonmel, in Tralee, and in Cork, who say, okay, we want to make the same deal that Deasy did. A prisoners' delegation from Cork jail told their commanding officers that they had an overwhelming mandate from other prisoners to follow Deasy's lead. And Tom Berry was one of the first Southern Division officers who met the delegation in February 23. And now he seems to have been, this wasn't his first initiative to kind of end the conflict. It seems to have started as early as August 22, so within a month of starting the war of the conflict. But then after Deasy's surrender, then that became the focus of almost all of his energies, of his and his wife. And they worked closely with Father Duggan right throughout the summer of 23. And as we know, that the anti-treaty leadership in February rejected his appeal. But Liam Lynch, who's worried, he goes down to meet the Southern Division and some of the Kerry brigades in February. And he speaks to them. And they also say, okay, the officers that he speaks to said, okay, we'll continue fighting, but they're basically saying we're going to lose, all right? And what clearly is being discussed at this stage is that they're going to ramp up attacks on civilians, and there's talk now of attacking the families of Free State soldiers. And Barry, when he's there, says, look, you should listen to the prisoners. Okay, there is no point. This is a waste of our manpower, right? If these people are executed in these situations. And then it all becomes very embarrassing for the anti-treaty executive, because a lot of these documents and these minutes get captured and then they're published in the Irish Independent in April, and along with other peace moves by Barry. And so, but basically in Moss Toomey in the 1950s, he told Ernie O'Malley that Barry and another Cork IRA officer named Tom Crofts had basically convinced most of the Southern Division to support a surrender, because the IRA in the South was just going to bits. And so, but it had no impact. Lynch basically continued to insist that they fight on, and he basically told the prisoners that, who were looking to discuss peace terms, that they were either going to stop or they would be treated as traitors. Now, what I think what's very interesting is some of the letters that Liam Deasy wrote, because he gave his official unconditional surrender, and then he wrote letters as well to De Valera and other people, and it really outlines his thinking. Brother and brother against brother is fine, but the thing is, it was just so you know, it was put together from notes and things by a priest named Father Tim Lyne after he had died. So, I just don't trust it. I mean, it's not that, I'm sure some of it is fine, but DC never got to look over it or approve it. And so he sets out his reasoning. He says, he basically says, we're losing, all right? We're getting weaker and weaker. The National Army is getting stronger and stronger and gaining support. And he's very worried about the course of the war and what this was going to lead to, and the cycle of reprisals and counter reprisals. And he was basically saying that what's going to happen is non-combatants are going to become the main victims of this conflict, and it's going to be family against family. This is the quote here: until the losses on both sides will be so great, some other power, probably England, will be called on to intervene, and possibly will be welcomed with more enthusiasm than will be displayed at her departure. In other words, they're saying that the British are going to come back and the Irish population is going to welcome them, and everything that they've done over the past few years was going to be just as to naught. And to be honest with you, I think this is a pretty realistic assessment of their position. It's one of the interesting things you find when you look both at the interviews with Cork veterans that a man named John Chisholm did in the 60s, and also the one that Ernie O'Malley did in the 1940s or 50s, is how little rancor there was against Deasy. He never had the same public profile as Tom Barry, but he was very well liked and very respected individual, and he did a lot of campaigning for veterans. And setting up veterans organizations afterwards. So he did a lot for people, and he was a very even irredentist like Moss Toomey respected him, and he said so. He basically kind of not exactly defending what DC had done, but he was saying that basically it was an honest attempt to end a war that he knew he'd lost, whereas the other. Fianna Fáil and this lot had just basically swallowed all the treaty willingly, and that's something that DC hadn't done. So really it's extraordinary, and the veterans are quite clear that they say it knocked the skittles out of them, DC's surrender, but at the same time they knew it was right, and so it's. And so I think, to be honest with you, I think much more attention should be paid to this kind of crucial moment in January and February, when you have, and what the prisoners were saying and what the prisoners were doing, and kind of broaden out the debate a little bit about war aims, and also about kind of what it says about the kind of the nature of the anti-treaty IRA, so, the war aims and stuff is interesting. I know it might be a controversial thing to say at a military history conference, but there was a lot more going on, and I think you can that you can use to contextualize the military campaign. You get a better understanding of things, and I think as other people, I'm almost finished now, as attitudes towards negotiated peace on both sides hardened as time went on, as I think other people have mentioned. Anti-treatyites insisted that dismantling the treaty was a precondition for peace talks. The government would accept nothing less than complete surrender of the irregulars, as they called them. Lynch basically maintained his pretty much unshakable conviction that victory was still possible, or at least they shouldn't stop fighting. And the IRA dumped arms and admitted defeat within a few weeks of his death. And that was basically pretty much the end of the Civil War, although both the IRA and demobilized Irish Army soldiers made parts of the country pretty much ungovernable for a lot of 1924. And if you think about it, actually, 1924 is another part, and the efforts to kind of settle the country needs more research as well, because in some ways that was kind of one of the diciest periods of the Civil War, was actually in terms of the survival of the government came then, or I would argue that. And finally, in an international context, I think Ireland's experience of civil war was bad as it was, and there's no denying that horrible things happened. It was far less savage than Finland in 1918, than Spain in the 30s, or Greece in the 40s. And I would suggest that part of the reason for that is because at key points during and after the fight, both sides kind of stepped back from the brink. And I would say that Liam Deasy in 1923 is an example of that. The amnesty in November 24 that was brought in by the Free State government, which says basically said there wasn't going to be any criminal prosecutions for what had happened during the Civil War. And you find that within a decade, both warring sides are sitting in an elected Dáil. And it's funny, in the lead up to that, Fianna Fáil and Frank Aiken were saying that when they got into power, they were going to abolish the 1924 MSPs. They were just going to abolish them. Now, this would have been a terrible thing to do. It would have been very politically destabilizing. But what they did instead is they just expanded it, as we know, to include anti-treatyites and neutrals and female activists. And so what that did is allow the pensions legislation to become a mechanism for bringing in anti-treatyites in from the cold. All right, and so it's another example of ways that in the end, despite all the bluster and the shouting, they made very sensible decisions. And so, Ireland survived as a democracy. I think it's the only new state set up after the Great War that did survive as a democracy. It was conservative. There was problems with how things were, some things were organized, but it survived as a democracy. And as I said, in interwar Europe, that was no mean feat. And that's it.
Another brilliant contribution to our conference. I'm sure everybody will agree. I think it's important, especially in a conference that's about a war, that we don't forget that there were people throughout that period who were striving for peace and trying to bring some kind of peace settlement between the two warring parties. So thanks for that, Eve. Very much appreciated.